Shalom Mishpachim, welcome to His Narrow Bridge. Our time together today is meant to immerse ourselves in the Word of Yahweh. It is meant to be a personal time of connection to the Word for each of us. I will read each word as translated in English in an interlinear Hebrew Bible. These shows are pre-recorded, so I will be in chat when they air. Feel free to use the chat to post anything that comes to your mind as we read the word. We will begin with prayer, followed by time for each of us to say our own personal prayers. Our beloved friend Alan Horvath taught us, make Elohim number one on a list of one. We pray in the name of Elohim, which includes Yahweh, Yeshua, and the Ruach HaKodesh. Thank you, Elohim, for our lives and all you provide. We ask for a hedge of protection around our mishpacha as we pray and study. We love you dearly. We are your children. We come to you with questions as we seek our personal relationships with you. Please help us learn. If any darkness enters our time together, we ask you now to rebuke it. We will now listen to your word as we immerse ourselves in it and let it speak to us.
Acts chapter 25. And when Festus arrived at Caesarea, he, after 3 days, went up to Jerusalem, and the chief priests and the head men of the Yahudians made representations to him concerning Paul. And they petitioned him, asking of him the favor that he would send for him to come to Jerusalem, they placing an ambush to slay him by the way. Verse 4. But Festus made answer, Paul is in custody at Caesarea, where I am also going. Therefore let those among you who are able to go down with us and make presentment of every offense there is in the man. And when he had been there for 8 or 10 days, he came down to Caesarea, and the next day he sat on the tribunal and commanded Paul to be brought. And when he came, the Yahudians who had come from Jerusalem surrounded him and preferred against him many and weighty charges which they were unable to substantiate. Meanwhile, Paul maintained that he had committed no offense, either against the Jewish Torah, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Footnote 198. Jewish Torah here is in contrast with oral law. Rav Shaul knew he was in violation of the oral Torah, or Talmud, but according to the written instruction of Moshe, he walked uprightly. Even his accusers never denied this fact. Verse 9. But Festus, because he was disposed to conciliate the favor of the Yahudians, said to Paul, Will you go up to Jerusalem and there be tried before me for these things? Paul replied and said, I stand before Caesar's tribunal. Here I should be tried. Against the Yahudians I have committed no offense, as you also well know. If I had committed any crime or done anything worthy of death, I would not refuse to die. But if none of the things of which they accuse me is upon me, no one may sacrifice me to their will. I will announce an appeal to Caesar. Then Festus conferred with his counselors and said, Have you declared an appeal to Caesar? To Caesar you will go. Verse 13. And when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice came down to Caesarea to salute Festus. And when they had been with him some days, Festus related to the king the case of Paul, saying, a certain man was left a prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Yahudians informed me respecting him, and desired that I would pass judgment upon him in their favor. And I told them, it is not the custom of the Romans to give up a man gratuitously to be slain, unless his accuser appears and charges him to his face, and opportunity is afforded him to make defense respecting what is charged upon him. And when I had come here without delay, I the next day sat on the tribunal and commanded the man to be brought before me. And his accusers stood up with him, and they were not able to substantiate any criminal charge against him, as I had expected. But they had certain controversies with him respecting their worship, and respecting one Yeshua, who died, but who, as Paul said, was alive. And because I was not well established in regard to these questions, I said to Paul, do you ask to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters? But he requested to be reserved for a trial before Caesar, and I ordered him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. And Agrippa said, I should like to hear that man. And Festus said, tomorrow you will hear him. Footnote 199. Agrippa II. Agrippa I had died after uttering blasphemy, according to both Luke and the historian Josephus. Please see the footnote on Acts 12:20. Verse 23. And the next day came Agrippa and Bernice with great pomp, and entered the house of trials with the chief captains and chiefs of the city. And Festus commanded, and Paul came. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all persons present with us, concerning this man whom you see, all the people of the Yahudians applied to me at Jerusalem, and also here, crying out that he ought no longer live. Footnote 200 is a technicality. Verse 25. Yet on investigation I found that he has done nothing deserving death, but because he requested to be reserved for the hearing of Caesar, I have ordered him to be sent. And I know not what I can write to Caesar in regard to him, and therefore I wished to bring him before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, that when his case will have been heard, I may find what to write. For it is unsuitable when we send up a prisoner not to designate his offense.
The whole thing started with an image that I made for, there's a collection that I heard about of the gentleman who has a collection of all based on the human hand. And I made this print for him for his collection, Henry Buell. It's in that collection now. I made this print, which is a version of this gesture. And that kind of started the whole thing. This, of course, I introduced into Star Trek as a Vulcan greeting. But it actually comes from a religious experience that I had when I was about 8 or 9 years old in the synagogue during the high holiday services, when the priests of the Hebrew tribes, they're called Kohanim, blessed the congregation. In English, the translation is, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his countenance to shine upon you. May the Lord turn his graciousness unto you and grant you peace. Well, when they're saying that, they use this gesture, both hands pointed at the audience, at the congregation. And I remember my father said to me, don't look. and everybody's got their eyes covered or their heads covered with their prayer shawls. But I snuck a peek. I was 8 years old. And I saw these gentlemen doing this. And I was fascinated by it. I learned how to do it. I didn't know what it meant. This is the shape of a Hebrew letter, which is the letter Shin. It makes the SH sound in the Hebrew alphabet. And that letter is the first letter in the word Shaddai, which is a name for the Almighty. So the idea is they're blessing the congregation, or using a symbol of God's name as they bless the congregation with their hands out like that as they say this prayer. And they're chanting it and they're shouting it. It was really very theatrical and very passionate. And it made an impression on me. So I kept that in my mind, not really understanding what it was all about. Later I learned that this was the shape of the letter Shin, but it took me a long, long time to find out why you're not supposed to look. And I asked this question of our rabbi, must be 8 or 9 years ago, and he said, you're not supposed to look because the belief is that when they say that prayer and they use that gesture, they are summoning the Shekhinah, which is the feminine aspect of God, and she comes into the sanctuary to bless the congregation. And if you see her, it could be very damaging because the light, the power of her presence could be fatal. You could die at worst, and at least be injured. So people cover their eyes. I peeked and I survived. But when I heard that story, I was fascinated with that. I thought, that's a wonderful spiritual idea, you know. And I began to explore the possibility of expressing that in photographs. The first thing I did was, here's an image, another version of it, with the human hands, obviously, and the two-handed version. Then I began to experiment. I was shooting a female figure at the time, and I began to experiment with lacing in the letter Shin into some of these images. This is a Shin here, this is a Shin on her arm. So I began to introduce that letter into some of these early images that I had. And then I began to branch out from there. From the time that I decided that I was going to work on the Shekhinah idea to the time that we had a book was about 3 years. Pretty intense project. It took a lot of work.
So, first force I want to mention is gravity, because that's certainly the first force that was experienced by humankind. I argued a long time ago that Newton didn't discover gravity by having an apple fall on his head. Some cave person knew about gravity. Apes swinging in trees know about gravity. Birds certainly know intuitively about gravity. So we've known about gravity for a long time. Gravity itself, though, as a formal theory, emerged with Newton in the late 1600s, and Newton, for the first time, had unified terrestrial motion and celestial motion and understood them to be aspects of the same thing. So in putting gravity here on my picture, I've already assumed one of the important unifications. Before Newton's theory of gravity, it was not understood that the motion of the moon and the other celestial bodies was really the same thing as the motion of an apple falling here on Earth. Newton unified that with his theory of gravity. Two other forces that are important are the electric force, and associated with it the study of electricity, electric charge, electric currents, that sort of thing. And separately, the force of magnetism, the force of interaction between two magnets, between a compass needle and the Earth's magnetic field, the force of magnetism. Those were studied originally as two separate forces. But as you know from the lecture on electromagnetism, the important point about the subject, electromagnetism, is that it arose because physicists began to understand the connections between electricity and magnetism. As those connections became more clear, as it became obvious that that was not just a coincidence but an intimate connection, ultimately it became evident that electricity and magnetism are really two aspects of the same thing. I didn't dwell on this when we did special relativity, but one of the other things that special relativity mixes besides space and time is electricity and magnetism. What looks like pure electricity to one observer looks like electricity and magnetism together to another observer. Electricity and magnetism are two aspects of the same thing, two sides of the same coin, and Maxwell's unification in the 1860s basically puts those together as one subject, electromagnetism. And the electromagnetic force was one of the four fundamental forces that was understood to be fundamental, as far as we could tell, until about the 1970s and 1980s. So we had electromagnetism, and we've got gravity sitting here as fundamental forces at this point. The weak force was discovered in nuclear reactions. That was discovered in the early part of the 20th century. It's a little bit obscure, but again, it mitigates certain kinds of nuclear decays, not all of them, and it's important on the sun and making the sun shine. So it's one of the forces that's involved in nuclear interactions. It's the weak force, and it was understood as a separate, independent force of nature through much of the 20th century. But as I indicated earlier, in 1970, theorists succeeded in describing the weak force and electromagnetism as two aspects of the same thing, a further kind of unification. And by the 1980s, experimental evidence accumulated to confirm that this was indeed correct. So by the 1980s, we had the electroweak force as one of the fundamental forces. Under different circumstances, it may manifest itself as the weak force. The electromagnetic force and the electromagnetic force under different circumstances may manifest itself as the electric force and the magnetic force. By the way, one of these features of these unified forces is that when you go to situations where the energy is very high, as it was in the early universe, what now appear to us as separate forces were all unified and just acted as one basic interaction. So things are more complex now. It's that big theme of the universe cooling and getting more complex. And one result of that complexity is the fundamental force or forces then become manifest as separate individual forces that seem distinct until our theorists and experimentalists go to work and figure out that they really are aspects of the same thing. So we have the electroweak force. And then we have the color force, which many physicists would still call the strong force or even the nuclear force, but I like the word color force because one of the aspects quarks have is called color. It has absolutely nothing to do with color, and the color force binds quarks that have different colors. They're called red, green, and blue, and it means nothing in terms of regular red, green, and blue, but the force is called the color force, and the study of quarks and how they stick together is called quantum chromodynamics, in analogy with quantum electrodynamics, which is the relativistic electric force. So we have the color force, ultimately resulting in the strong force, the nuclear force, and so on. And here's where we stand basically today. I argued earlier in my lecture on the Standard Model and the structure of matter that we have three fundamental forces: electroweak force, color force, gravity, and we don't know how to unify them further. Most physicists would argue we're quite close to understanding the electroweak force and the color force as aspects of some more fundamental underlying force. We aren't there yet, but theorists are close. We do not have the power or the energy with our accelerators to create the conditions that would show us that unification, not yet anyway, but theorists are working on that, and we believe it will not be very long before we understand the electroweak force and the color force as aspects of one force. And that would be called grand unification, and we might call that force a grand unified force. So watch for that. That may happen in your lifetimes, if not sooner. In fact, all this may happen in your lifetime, but not sooner, but the next one is a bit of a longer shot. So there we are. We may, in a matter of years to decades, be down to two fundamental forces: a grand unified force that breaks down into color force and electroweak force, further into electric and magnetic and weak force, and so on. The real challenge, and that's what the topic of today's lecture is the further unification of gravity with the grand unified force once we have the grand unified force, and that would give us a theory of everything, because that would unite all the known forces into one. I don't know what we're going to call that force. Some people call it supersymmetry because of certain mathematical properties of the theories. Others simply call it a theory of everything, because if there's nothing left undiscovered, there's nothing new, there are no unknown forces that we haven't discovered yet, then the theory of everything will describe all interactions in the universe in terms of one fundamental basic force. And we'll understand how, in different circumstances, that force will appear as gravity or as a grand unified force or as the electroweak force or whatever, but we will understand it as one fundamental interaction. That's one of the holy grails of physics, to find the theory of everything.
For more information about these videos, look at the video description and click More. You can then have links to my YouTube channel and the YouTube playlist, which has all the Aramaic English New Testament videos, Bible Hub links, and Odiote. So this is useful because you can click a chapter and go word by word through the scriptures and get details about each word and where they are used throughout the Bible.